Thursday, join me for a special edition of On the Record, Faith, Fear, and Freedom. This live conversation is not about politics. We'll focus on our Muslim neighbors, their faith and experiences. We'll also talk with local Muslim leaders about identifying and reporting extremism, followed by a powerful WRAL documentary exploring the lives of local Muslims. Thursday at 7, only WRAL.
The gun battle between police and Mohammed Yusuf Abdulaziz at the scene where he murdered 4 Marines.
89 people were killed in the attack at the concert hall.
ISIS has claimed responsibility.
The FBI says their extremist views evolved even before ISIS rose to power.
Attacks this year by extremists have been horrific and deadly. Now average Muslims around the country are targets of hatred and violence.
But every Muslim is a terrorist.
And we could end those Muslims before they walk in.
Total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
Tonight, a look at what is Islam, what life is like for Muslims in our area, and how the Islamic community is helping prevent and catch extremism. On the Record, Faith, Fear, and Freedom. Thank you for joining us for this special edition of On the Record. I'm David Crabtree. And for the next hour, Muslims and non-Muslims will join us for an important and in-depth conversation. Simply talking with one another is something we often fail to do when we are gripped by fear and misunderstanding. So tonight, our goal is to learn how to better understand, respect, and listen to each other without being afraid, close-minded, or bigoted. And to understand, as a Muslim leader said to me recently, the face of terror is not the true faith of Islam. While watching, join the social media conversation by using the hashtag #NCMuslims. There is much who we as non-Muslims simply don't understand about Islam, what it is not. So let's begin with the basics. Islam began in Mecca, Saudi Arabia. The religion was revealed to humanity by the Prophet Muhammad. Those who follow Islam are called Muslims. Muslims believe there is only one God. The Arabic word for God is Allah.
As a Muslim, your goal is to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
According to Muslims, God sent a number of prophets to humankind to teach us how to live according to His law. Jesus, Moses, and Abraham are respected as prophets of God. Muhammad is revered as the seal of the prophets, the last and greatest of the messengers of God. He is not divine in any way. Muslims believe that Islam is the final version of a monotheistic faith that has always existed and includes Judaism and Christianity. For practical purposes, they date their religion from when Muhammad first received revelation. Muslims base their laws on this, their holy book, the Quran.
We must keep our focus on pleasing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and striving for the next life and akhirah.
Muslims believe there are 5 basic pillars of Islam: the declaration of faith, praying 5 times a day, giving money to charity, fasting, and a pilgrimage at least once in their lifetime to Mecca. Joining us now from the Islamic Association of Raleigh, Imam Muhammad Abu Talib, and author and teacher Yasmin Mujahid. My apologies if I've mispronounced the name in any way, but my thanks to both of you for being here. The most common misconception about Islam is what?
I think it's that Islam condones terrorism and violence. And in fact, the Quran is very clear and unequivocal on the prohibition of killing innocent lives and civilians. Among the many verses that discuss this are a verse in chapter number 5, where God says, whomever kills a single soul, it's as if he has killed all of humanity. And I think our voices coming out clearly against terrorism and violence, recognizing that Muslims are victims along with our fellow human beings and fellow Americans, is the biggest misconception.
And yet just earlier today, someone emailed me and said, will you ask about the verse regarding the killing of infidels? A verse that has been used as what I call bumper sticker theology, to just be pasted up against something to condemn Islam. And I responded, it needs context to understand what that is talking about. Did I state that properly, or is it something that as a Christian and non-Muslim I should be concerned about?
No, I think you absolutely hit the nail right on the head. Actually, there's a video circulating the internet right now in Europe where people disguise the Bible actually with a fake cover in the Quran, and they take quotations from it that deal with violence, as many texts do, as pretty much all of the Holy Scriptures do. And people react to it as if it's the Quran. And then at the end, they remove that cover and show that it's a Bible and expose people's bigotry and assumptions. And what's incredible is that's not an academic or appropriate reading of the Bible. It's not an appropriate reading of the Quran. Context is very important.
The bigotry is very real. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And I think that when you asked about what is the biggest misconception, I think that, and this is linked to the bigotry, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that a lot of people view Islam as something very foreign. They view Muslims as foreign. And I think what we really need to realize is that Muslims are not something from another country. It's also not a belief that's actually very different or something even new. And I think when people understand what it is that Muslims really believe, they'll find that there's so many similarities in terms of our core beliefs. When we talk about the idea of praying to one God, that's something that all the monotheistic religions agree with. The idea of charity, the idea of generosity and the way we treat our neighbors and that kind of thing, that there's so much shared there's so much shared beliefs and practices, but I think it's been painted as something very foreign. And in fact, when someone sees me dressed this way, for example, sometimes they'll ask me questions like, where are you from? And I'll say Wisconsin, but the idea is that they're expecting me to say Saudi Arabia, but Islam is very much indigenous and it's very much American.
But you understand the mistrust right now.
I do understand, but I think it's a very manufactured mistrust, and it's not necessary at all. But it's something that's being manufactured for, unfortunately, political reasons, on both ends of the spectrum, in fact.
If you could speak to Donald Trump tonight, what would you say to him?
I would tell him that I think that the way that he is speaking and the type of sentiment that he's spreading is actually very, very un-American and against the Constitution.
Are you hopeful?
Of
both sides coming to a better understanding, both sides. Those of us who do not understand Islam, who may be distrustful at times, are you hopeful that it's getting better or will get better?
I think ironically, the extreme statements that Donald Trump made actually united us more than it separated us, because I think a lot of people started to understand the type of Islamophobia that we as Muslims are dealing with. Once he made that statement, a lot of people came out in support for Muslims, and I think it actually brought about a lot of cooperation and cohesion, in fact.
We have a lot to talk about tonight. I thank you for your participation and your insight. And up next, 14 years post 9/11. What's it like to live in the Triangle as a Muslim? We'll hear even more firsthand. Muslims around the country have held vigils for terrorism victims, rallied in denouncing ISIS, and began campaigns promoting tolerance and compassion. Yet the FBI reports hate crimes against Muslims are rising. Catherine Brown gives us a look at what it's like to be a Muslim in the Triangle right now.
When Kulsum Tasnif can't find the words, her emotions pour out on canvas.
It's basically a Muslim woman crying.
She created this in the hours after Islamic extremists attacked Paris.
And it was just a translation as to what Muslims were feeling, which was sadness, which was devastation. It was a sense of hopelessness.
With each attack by extremists, Tasnif, a Muslim artist living in Raleigh, feels the ripple effect of distrust and fear, and she worries about her 3 children.
It's hard speaking to my kids because they're fairly innocent, and I don't want to scare them.
In Durham, Wasim Shahzad faces similar challenges.
For me, actually, it breaks my heart.
The hate-filled rhetoric he has to explain to his kids, the stares and questions, the blatant Islamophobia, which he says has become more bold in the wake of calls by Donald Trump and evangelist Franklin Graham for a complete shutdown of Muslims into the U.S.
Muslim women, have their scarves, snatched off while grocery shopping with their kids. We've had, people come up and say, "Are you Muslim?" Yes. Well, go back to where you're from. Well, I'm from here. Where you want me to go?
For Shahzad, a former Marine, the notion that he's anything but loyal to his country is particularly piercing.
It brings out that extreme side, the extreme fringe in the public, that want to use this as an excuse to hurt other people. And that's where the Muslim community is fearful of.
Though few have felt it quite as personally as Mohammed Abu Salah.
Of all people, we know what it means to have your loved ones killed suddenly for no reason.
His daughters, 19-year-old Razan and 21-year-old Yasur, were murdered in February, along with Yasur's husband, Dia Barakat.
We believe beyond any shadow of a doubt it was a hate crime.
He calls the accused gunman, Craig Hicks, a terrorist, yet wonders why others do not. He works tirelessly to tell the world about his daughters, young, philanthropic Americans.
So when terrorist acts happen, we feel as if everything we did went in vain. Because we know immediately that somebody will come out on TV and target us all.
Still, Abu Salah sees hope. So does Wasim Shahzad and Kulsum Tasnif in the compassion from many Americans and the curiosity and genuine interest they express. Though very different, these three share a common thread, a determination to rise above hate and set a living example of peace. Catherine Brown, WRAL News, Raleigh.
Here now, as we continue this conversation, Imam Abu Talib is still with us from the Islamic Association of Raleigh. From the group Muslims for Social Justice, Mr. Manzoor Chima, and Salahuddin Muhammad, who is the Associate Imam at the As-Salam Islamic Center in Raleigh. And you're also a black Muslim. And you've talked with me about what it is like that is different maybe from others at this table that I had no idea to explain.
Right.
What makes it different for you?
Well, when you look at the African Americans, you see people who have been trampled upon throughout the years. African Americans didn't immigrate to this country, but they were brought to this country to be slaves. And so out of that group, many of them, about 30%, were Muslims. And their religion was taken from them, and they were actually forced to come into Christianity. And then, by the grace of God, many of us embraced Islam, or I would say we re-embraced Islam because we felt that that was our religion. And so we have individuals who may have come to this country, and many of them have decided that they wanted to go take on the American dream, and so again, they kind of like stepped over the African-American Muslim. And we are people who have a narrative because we've been here the longest and we know what's going on.
Does it make it doubly hard for you as a Muslim to live in this community?
It makes it hard, but let me say this. We have been conditioned through slavery to take a lot. So we are able to take a lot, and I heard you ask earlier about being hopeful. You know, I don't want to talk about the narrative of being in fear. I fear God. So I am hopeful, we are hopeful that this thing is going to be turned around, and we believe it's going to be turned around because of what we do. Every morning, David, at 6 o'clock in the morning, I pray at the As-Salam Islamic Center, and I have men there with me who are veterans. They love America, they fought for this country, and they are Muslims.
But at the same time, the distrust, we can't ignore that the distrust is there.
This is a very good question, and once again, I will actually piggyback on Imam Salahuddin's comment. Basically, the largest number of Muslims in America, the biggest ethnic group of Muslims in America, are African American Muslims who were brought as slavery. So me, as an immigrant Muslim, when I see that crisis, I have to see the legacy of African American Muslims as well as the civil rights movement. Some of the most beloved heroes in America, Muhammad Ali, the boxer, he's a Muslim. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, the basketball legend, is a Muslim. So when people demonize Muslims, when people dehumanize Muslims, or when there's a talk of saying that we need to push Muslims out, all we have to say to show Americans the legacy of Muslims in America. Right. And as immigrant Muslims, we are inspired by African American Muslims. That's one of the reasons we founded Muslim for Social Justice.
And you know, no matter what you say, though, there are people watching saying, okay, when something major happens, and whether it's a radicalized Muslim or whomever it may be, that it appears that you are more silent than the community wants you to be in rapid condemnation of what's happened. Is that fair that we may view it that way? And if so, why is it?
You know, David, I think I understand exactly where such a viewer would be coming from. They see a horrible act done in the name of Islam, and they're appalled. They're horrified. And they want to be reassured that Muslims are just as appalled. And I want to say that we are not only just as appalled, we are even more horrified. Absolutely. Because we not only lose what they lose, we're victims too, Americans, human beings, but in addition, this is done in the name, falsely, in the name of Islam, in the name of our religion.
Do you feel vulnerable?
I think, you know, it's really important to remember something. I'm always reminding our congregation, and I would say the same to our viewers. It's not really fear of Muslims that people are experiencing. It's that they're afraid about what is said about Muslims. So we have visitors to our center every week, multiple times. And sometimes they will see tension visibly in the visitors, clenched fists, anger, because they're expecting as they step into a mosque what they've heard on TV. Right. And I remind myself, our congregants, and them not to give in to that. When we share tea, when we have a biscuit, when we talk, we find we share so much, and even where we differ, we learn to respect one another.
And I hope that will continue, and I hope more people will visit your mosque and your mosque. We've got to move on in this conversation. I know it was brief but intense, and I thank the three of you for being here. When we come back tonight, we have heard Islam and mainstream Muslims don't promote violence. We just heard that. But there's no denying that extremist beliefs are a growing problem. Next, a look at what's happening here to prevent and catch and stop the violent views. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The Islamic community here in the Triangle is actively working to prevent extremist beliefs from developing and thriving. Cullen Browder shows us how.
After 9/11, Islamic extremism spread to North Carolina.
Good morning.
In 2006, Mohammed Terrazar injured 9 when he drove a Jeep into a crowd on UNC's campus, calling it revenge for Muslim deaths around the world. In 2009, federal authorities broke up a suspected terrorist plot in Johnston County, arresting Daniel Boyd, his 2 sons, several others, and confiscating a cache of weapons. And in recent months, Bassett Sheikh of Cary landed in federal court, charged with trying to join al-Qaeda-linked fighters in Syria.
Our number one priority is national security, and we're about that every day.
U.S. Attorney Thomas Walker leads the terrorism fight in eastern North Carolina.
We cannot win this war on violent extremism without engaging with the Muslim community.
There is no home for terror in our center.
Rashid Salahat heads up security for the Islamic Association of Raleigh. He's part of that ongoing conversation with law enforcement about both those threatening to hurt Muslims.
I am an American.
And Muslims showing violent tendencies.
What happened to this community affects all of us. So if we see any danger, any suspicious person, we will report that person.
It's not an existential threat to our existence, but it's a serious one.
Duke Professor David Shanzer, director of the Triangle Center on Terrorism and Homeland Security, advocates educating and enlisting the public. See something, say something.
Forward as an early warning system, that's really the best way we have to prevent acts of violence, terrorism.
Online recruitment complicates those prevention efforts. This is the evolution of terrorism. Groups continually use social media to influence and isolate.
There's a notion that people get radicalized in their mosque. I think that's wrong. I think that people get radicalized online.
Remember that Boyd terror case? Authorities credit members of the local Muslim community for alerting the FBI to suspicious activity.
And that all goes back to communication and trust.
Cullen Browder, WRAL News, Raleigh.
Here now at this table, the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina, Thomas Walker, who you saw in Cullen's report. Also, Abdullah Antepli, who's a Muslim cleric who has worked side by side with the U.S. Attorney and has had deep ties in this community. I was just listening to what was said in that piece about self-reporting and what David Shanzer said, educating and enlisting, see something, say something. At the same time, When is it going to come that I'm on a flight and I see you, or I see a woman in a headscarf, and I'm not suspicious and you're not suspicious of me?
Well, those days are not going to come anytime soon, David, unfortunately. The kind of fear campaign has been around Islam and Muslims. The kind of Islam is evil, Muslims are terrorists message has been repeated enough number of times. And anything and everything uniquely Islamic or Muslim looking, you don't even have to be Muslim. Look at the Sikh community. Look at the South Asian community. They are not even Muslim, but they look like Muslim. They are subjected to same kind of fear, same kind of suspicion, same kind of distrust. It's going to take some time. I think recent events showed us how much we have recovered our own previous racism, anti-Semitism, and this is a similar conflict, similar fight. It's going to take a few more generations.
You just uttered a word a lot of people don't want to when you said racism.
Yes.
There are people who believe that at the core of this fear is racism. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that. If this fear is uniquely about Islam and Muslims, and if Muslims put their acts together, this will disappear, I fundamentally disagree. This is not only misleading, but it's unhelpful. This is another manifestation of the same human failure, same evil force of hate or racism. It manifests itself in the form of racial issues, anti-Semitism, or anti-Catholicism. This is another similar challenge for American society.
And Thomas Walker, I know you have met with the Muslim community several times over the past few years since you've been in this role. Do you see the relationships between Muslims and non-Muslims getting better here in this region, staying the same, or worse?
I think that what we have right now is an opportunity. And I think that this, what we're doing here tonight, is so crucial that there be a conversation. I want to comment on something that Iman said. I do think that racism is an element of it. I also think that ignorance is a big element of it, and that we fear what we don't know. And it's easy to fear those who don't look like us, that don't act like us, and who appear differently from us. So these conversations build trust, and trust builds better communication and conversation.
I know the case in Chapel Hill is not in your jurisdiction. That's in the Central Division for the U.S. Attorney's Office. But you have also told me that the government, you want people to know that this government works for every citizen in this country to make sure that no stone is unturned in doing their investigations.
I think it's vitally important for us to say to the Muslim community in America, who are contributing citizens to this country and part of the fabric of this country, that when something happens to one of them, just like if something happened to a member of my family, I would expect my government to do everything they could do to try to figure out why it happened and how we could prevent it again and how to punish the person appropriately who did the things that happened. So I think it's vital to do that.
Are you hopeful?
I'm very hopeful. I am hopeful. I know that we live in trying times. I know that we live in fearful times, but I am hopeful that as we begin to understand each other, that bridges can be built. It takes longer to build a bridge than just pave a road. And so I'm hopeful that we can do that.
Thomas Walker, thank you for coming in. When we come back tonight, the strong support for Muslims from other spiritual leaders. Making progress never happens in a vacuum, and leaders from other faiths and other religions are helping. Two of them joined the previous conversation. Now, the Right Reverend Ann Hodges Koppel, the Bishop Pro Tempore of the Episcopal Church, the Diocese of North Carolina, Rabbi Eric Solomon from Raleigh's Beth Meyer Synagogue, and Abdullah Antepli, Imam, is with us as we continue. You've been listening to this conversation. What's caught you off guard? What surprised you that you didn't know?
Well, I don't know that I'm surprised as much as I continue to be just rather heartsick that we even have to be having this discussion in 2015. It makes my heart heavy. And especially as a Christian, as a member of what is a majority faith community in our area, that Christians who follow a Savior who preaches love and forgiveness, who died to set us free from fear of death and free to be alive and free to love neighbors and overcome differences. So it makes me heartsick that those who claim to follow Jesus could be now back imprisoned by their fears and be speaking with words that are filled with suspicion and hate. That's hard for me as a Christian leader to acknowledge.
We like to say all are welcomed, all are included. Is that tougher in the times in which we live now, Rabbi?
Listen, David, this is a very difficult time for me as a Jew. My grandparents were all immigrants. You could argue refugees to this country. And my love for America is deep as a Jew, as an American. But I remember deeply my own people, again, my family, but also historically, being oppressed even in this own country, and anti-Semitism arising as immigrants, as being different, as being other. And albeit the fact that we all recognize that there are people who are radicalized across religious communities, and there are issues that all of us need to address, including Muslims, including Jews, including Christians. However, to label a whole community this way and to bring language of such ostracization and dehumanization, perhaps even, God forbid, is upsetting me and many in my community at the core of what it means to be a Jew.
You know, we have, and I don't want to make this about politics, but Donald Trump has said what he said. Ted Cruz, who is doing very well in some of the polls, says only those who believe in Jesus should be allowed to resettle in this country. When you hear that, what do you think?
Well, it makes me, as our Reverend said here, basically sick. You cannot be more un-American than that. If anything in this country, we never do that. We never do religious tests before we extend our hand of help, hand of mercy, hand of grace to anybody and everybody. But these politicians are not the problem. They don't keep me up in the night. What makes me lose my sleep is the number of people who actually believe them. It resonates with a number of Americans, unfortunately. Fear doesn't reveal the best of anybody. And they are basically fueling the fire and trying to sustain this culture of fear and suspicion around Islam and Muslims. That's what we need to address, not these few politicians who are trying to score some cheap political points.
So what do we do to break this cycle of fear?
Well, in the communities I'm most familiar with, I am hopeful where I see our religious communities coming together in interfaith activities. I mean, it's building relationships at a habitat site. It's building relationships over the issues we have common cause with, which we see whether it's defending the environment or defending human dignity. And I wish some of those stories would get as much coverage as these politicians who I would wonder sometimes are even un-American activities. So there are good stories to tell. There's good stories to tell.
Point well taken. Rabbi?
We have to move out of our comfort zone and really reach beyond our stereotypes that we see on the television and really say, am I going to move over and connect, particularly at this moment, with our Muslim brothers and sisters and get to know them person to person, human to human, seen as being in God's image? From those relationships and depth of seeing the divinity, that's where we can move forward.
Rabbi Solomon, thank you. Abdullah and Tepli, always good to have you at this table.
My pleasure.
Bishop, wonderful to have you here. Perfect love does cast out all fear. It's difficult to live into it, but this is the beginning of a conversation that we are dedicated to continuing as long as we need to. This is just the beginning of our conversation about Islam and Muslims in North Carolina. Our stories and coverage will continue beyond this special. Right now, you can go to WRAL.com for a list of resources and a recording of this program, and join the discussion on social media using the hashtag NCMuslims. We thank all of those who participated tonight to make their effort to come and be with us at this table and offer their insight. And we thank you for joining us. Have a good evening.